June 12, 1872. The Mississippi Delta still carried the scars of war. 6 years had passed since the Civil War's end, yet the land remained unhealed. The fields were still fertile, white cotton still rolled across the plains like endless waves, but in every tree, every fence post, every weathered rooftop lingered the echoes of cannon fire, the cries of the enslaved, and the sighs of those who had lost everything, yet clung desperately to pride. Amid this fractured landscape stood one of the South's most powerful dynasties, the Harrowfields. From their grand two-story mansion, its white columns reaching skyward like a challenge to heaven itself, they had ruled for generations. Colonel Horace Harrowfield, the patriarch, sat in his leather chair like a king on a crumbling throne. Once a Confederate officer, his gray uniform now lay moth-eaten in a wooden chest. But in his heart, the South had never lost. His only daughter, Clara Harrowfield, was both his treasure and his burden. With hair the color of burnished copper and eyes that seemed to pierce through the suffocating walls of the mansion, she was trained to play piano, to recite poetry, to smile at the right moment and bow just so before wealthy suitors. But there was one thing Clara had never been taught: how to silence the restless fire within her, the hunger to breathe, to live, to escape the golden cage her father had built. If there had ever been a Southern Belle's handbook, its first chapter might have read, "Never step into the stables. There are no tea parties there, only sweat and danger." But Clara, of course, never cared for such books. On the other side of the invisible wall of class stood Elias Turner, a tall, broad-shouldered black man with hands hardened by years at the forge. Elias had once been enslaved, and though now free on paper, his reality was little different. He still worked the Harrowfield lands, still bowed when required, but never too low. In his gaze there was something that unsettled even the proudest white men. Elias walked the fields as though he belonged to the earth itself, not to any master, and most dangerously of all, when Clara looked at him, he dared to look back. That, dear reader, was the first sin. Not the glance itself, but the moment Clara answered with one held just a second too long. The Harrowfield mansion in those days was suffocating. At dusk, when the sun sank behind the cotton fields, its white walls glowed in the last light, yet the rooms within seemed to lock away secrets in the dark. Clara often slipped out to walk the narrow path toward the blacksmith's forge, where the steady rhythm of hammer on iron rang sharp against the night, a sound far truer than the forced melodies of the piano her father demanded each evening. That contrast fascinated her. While young Southern gentlemen bragged of universities and Charleston balls, Elias needed only fire and steel to shape a world of his own. That man seems freer than all those who claim to be free, Clara once thought. Meanwhile, Horace Harrowfield still dreamed of restoring his fallen empire. He arranged for Clara to meet the son of the wealthy Whitmore family, a proper match. To him, marriage was a chessboard, and his daughter merely a piece to be moved. What he did not know was that Clara had already begun a different game, one far more dangerous but far more alluring. The world outside clung to hollow words: Southern honor, family pride. But everyone knew those banners only covered rot. And in that rot, a forbidden love between Clara and Elias flickered to life, like a spark in dry grass. A spark that, if not extinguished, would consume the Harrowfields entirely. But Clara had no wish to snuff it out. And Elias, scarred by whips and chains, had nothing left to lose. This, then, is only the pulling back of the curtain. Behind it lies an entire stage of midnight meetings, whispered confessions, wounds that never healed, in a child born amid the storm. To understand why the blaze would one day engulf them all, we must return to that single reckless moment, the shared glance between a caged heiress and a blacksmith marked by chains. A glance that was no accident, but the ember of a fire. And from that ember would rise a flame strong enough to draw the Harrowfields into the whirlwind of love, betrayal, and the most dangerous thing of all: freedom. Clara Harrowfield was accustomed to the long, dragging days within the mansion's walls. From the outside, her life looked like a glittering dream: silk gowns, piano recitals, afternoon tea with neighboring ladies. But to live it for a single day was to realize it was nothing more than a gilded cage, an ornate prison holding a restless bird desperate to escape. Each morning she stepped onto the long veranda, gazing over the fields spread white with cotton. The laborers bent low, hands calloused, backs stooped. On paper they were free, but that freedom was as thin as oiled paper, fragile, ready to tear beneath the glare of Colonel Horace Harrowfield. Everyone trembled under his gaze, everyone except one, Elias Turner. He was no gentleman. His world was fire, smoke, and sweat, the work of a blacksmith. Yet from that toil rose something no schooling could ever teach: confidence. Each strike of his hammer against the glowing iron rang like a drumbeat, like the pulse of defiance. Elias walked the yard without bowing too low, his eyes never flinching, meeting every glance head-on. Clara first saw him not in some staged romance, but when her horse lost a shoe. Horace sent the animal to the forge, and Clara, curious, slipped away to follow. The forge blazed, sparks flaring against Elias's sweat-streaked face. His strong hands held the hammer as if it were an extension of himself. In that moment Clara froze, not from fear, but because, for the first time, she saw freedom in human form. Elias looked up. His dark eyes caught hers. She should have turned away immediately, bowed to propriety. But she didn't. Clara stood still, and even let a faint smile curl her lips. That alone thickened the air. If anyone had witnessed it, whispers would have flown. The Harrowfield girl smiled at a colored man. A scandal, an insult to the family's honor. From then on, Clara found excuses to pass near the forge. Sometimes she claimed she needed to check the carriage. Other times that she wished to sketch a scene of labor. No one truly believed her, but no one pressed further. Only Clara knew her real reason: to glimpse Elias. Just a moment, just a breath of air through the suffocating cage. Elias noticed. Each time she passed, he paused a beat, his eyes flicking toward her. Not long, not hurried, just enough for both their hearts to stumble. He did not bow deeply, nor did he dare smile too openly, but his gaze said what words could not. "I see you. I know you are not like the others." To Clara, those fleeting moments were honey. Once she left an old poetry book near the well by the trees. The next day it was gone. Days later, it reappeared, this time with a faint pencil mark beneath a line. "Love does not ask history's permission." Clara read that line over and over until it etched itself into her memory. She knew Elias had left it. Somehow, amid the harsh laws of the South, the two of them had begun building their own language, not with words but with glances, with poetry, with silences that spoke louder than speeches. Meanwhile, Horace Harrowfield plotted to marry Clara into wealth. One evening, sipping brandy, he told her, "You must think of the family's honor. Young Whitmore has just returned from Charleston. Very promising." Clara smiled faintly. "Yes, father." But in her heart, her answer was different. Never. Not ever. The divide between her two worlds sharpened daily. On one side, glittering banquets, polite laughter, engraved calling cards. On the other, the roaring furnace, the pounding hammer, the proud eyes of a blacksmith once chained. And Clara, though born to the first world, felt her heart leaning irrevocably toward the second. They say love begins with a glance. Here that was true in its rawest form. No romantic declarations, no violins, only fire, smoke, and silence that burned hotter than any song. And in its simplicity lay its danger. For each glance was not just desire, it was provocation against the monstrous beast called Southern tradition. What Clara did not yet know was that those stolen glances would soon grow into real meetings, moments where they could finally speak, confess, and share what they dared not before. And once words were spoken, there would be no turning back. A glance may be a beginning, but when that glance is followed by books, by whispered meetings in the dark, it becomes a flame. And soon that flame would turn the abandoned stables into a sanctuary for two souls, and the cradle for a storm no one could ever extinguish. They say every secret needs a sanctuary. For Clara and Elias, that sanctuary was the Western stable, an old structure from Horace's grandfather's time, now little more than cracked beams and a roof missing tiles. its doors groaning whenever the wind blew. To others it was nothing but a ruin. To them it was a hidden heaven, in the spark of a storm waiting to break. Clara first entered the stable one late afternoon, sketchbook in hand, intending to draw the fields. But as the door creaked open, she found Elias already there, leaning against a post, his hammer at his side, the light slanting through the gaps in the boards onto his sun-darkened face. For a moment, neither spoke. Clara hesitated, ready to leave, but Elias's voice came low and rough from smoke and fire. "Do you want me to go?" She shook her head. "No, I just didn't expect to find you here." They stayed a few paces apart, neither advancing nor retreating. Outside, the wind rattled the door like a drumbeat, urging them forward. Clara sat on a worn bench, opening her book. Elias picked up a block of wood and began to carve. The silence between them was not empty, but strangely warm. After that, they happened to meet again and again. At first, they pretended it was chance. Soon, both knew it wasn't. Clara brought old books, scraps of paper, sometimes apples from the back garden. Elias brought memories, fragments of a life Clara had never been allowed to hear. One evening she asked, "Did you ever learn to read?" Elias smiled faintly, tinged with bitterness. "Learn. Number. But I learned in secret. My mother carved letters into trees, into dirt, sometimes even into my skin. She said, 'They can bind your hands, but never your mind.'" Clara fell silent, then offered him her book of poems. Then, "Read with me." From then on, the stable became a clandestine classroom. Clara read aloud at first, her voice unsteady, then stronger. Elias listened, eyes half closed, as if tasting each word. When he read back, his deep voice gave the lines a new weight, as though the poems had been waiting for him all along. Another night, Elias told her of the whipping tree, where dozens had been lashed until they collapsed. He spoke lightly, but each word landed like a hammer blow. Clara gripped her hands, her eyes wet. She had never seen cruelty painted so close. In return, she told him of her mother's death, how illness had taken her early, leaving Clara with a father whose only passions were liquor and honor. "I never even said goodbye," she whispered. Elias said nothing, but his gaze carried all the understanding words could not. At first their meetings were chaste, just stories, books, memories. But closeness has its own law. The more it is hidden, the more fiercely it grows. One summer night, a sudden storm broke. Thunder shook the rafters, rain lashed the ground. Clara ran to the stable, her hair soaked, dress clinging to her. Elias was there, a lantern lit. When its glow touched her face, he stepped back as if afraid of himself. "You shouldn't be here," he murmured. Breathless, Clara answered, "I couldn't stay in that house." "I had to come." Silence filled the space again. But this time it burned. Heartbeats, rain, damp earth, the scent of oil smoke, all swelled into a single tide. And then they moved closer. In that instant, there was no mistress and blacksmith, no white and black, no master and the once enslaved. Only two souls, hands trembling, lips searching. The first kiss was hesitant, then it broke open, like lightning splitting the night sky. When Clara left, the rain had eased, but inside her a different storm had begun, and somewhere in the darkness, unseen eyes had watched. A secret is no longer a secret once it has a witness. In that moment, their forbidden love crossed into new territory, where every step forward might be a step toward the abyss. After that stormy night, everything between Clara and Elias changed. They were no longer two strangers sharing poems and quiet stories. Now, every meeting carried the heat of a forbidden secret, trembling yet irresistible. Clara still walked the Harrowfield halls like the obedient daughter. She still sat at the piano each evening, striking notes at her father's command. But in her mind, the music was only a mask. The true melody echoed elsewhere, inside the old stable, beneath the dim glow of an oil lamp on Elias's sun-worn face. At first, they were cautious. Clara came only 2 or 3 times a week, under the excuse of taking a walk. But desire is never defeated by restraint. Soon, their chance encounters became a necessity. One day, Clara brought a basket of apples. She bit into one, then handed the rest to Elias. He hesitated, then sank his teeth into the same spot she had touched. A small gesture, yet enough to make her flush and for him to suppress a smile. Another time Elias offered her a crude iron band he had forged. "Not gold or silver," he said, "but it cost me sweat." Clara clutched it, eyes glimmering. "It's worth more than anything I've ever worn." Their love grew fierce, but so did the danger. Clara knew the unspoken law. A white daughter consorting with a black man. This was not romance, it was a death sentence. Elias knew it better than anyone. He had seen men hang for nothing more than an accidental touch. And still he stayed. Not out of recklessness, but because, for the first time, he had something worth risking everything for. One sweltering afternoon, Clara entered the stable with eyes red and swollen. She carried no books, no fruit, only the weight of dread. "My father, he mentioned the Whitmores," she whispered. "He wants me married soon." "I can't." Elias clenched his fists. He had always known this day would come. To Horace Harrowfield, marriage was a chess move, his daughter just a piece to be placed. But that move would end everything between Clara and Elias. Clara laid her hand over his. "I don't care. I'd rather die than live like a doll locked in a cabinet." Her gaze burned. Elias exhaled, voice low and heavy like molten iron. "You don't understand, Clara. Here our love isn't just forbidden. It's a crime." Clara laughed bitterly. "If love is a crime, then I choose to be guilty." The words cut through every chain. Elias pulled her close, and this kiss was no longer timid. It was a storm. In that whirlwind, laws and threats dissolved. That night, though no rain fell, Clara trembled in Elias's arms. Their bodies entwined, reclaiming what history had stolen: the right to choose, the right to love, the right to be themselves. Afterward, they lay in silence on the hay. Clara rested her head on his chest, listening to his pounding heart. "Do you believe in fate?" she asked. He paused, then answered, "I only believe in consequences." Clara smiled faintly. "Then we've just begun both." Neither of them knew that in the shadows outside, someone had watched. Every embrace, every kiss, every transgression had been seen. In the South, secrets could live long, but once exposed, they spread faster than fire in summer fields. Clara and Elias's secret was no longer theirs alone. The storm of their love, barely blooming, was already standing on the edge of peril. A single night of passion can bring happiness, but it can also plant the seed of tragedy. For Clara and Elias, their love was no longer only in the heart, it was about to take shape in flesh and blood, in the form of a child. And once that happened, there would be no turning back for the Harrowfields. After that storm-swept night, Clara left the stable not only with her heart racing, but with a strange sensation, as though a new life had been kindled inside her. At first, she dismissed it, telling herself it was only the aftershock of overwhelming emotion. But time has a cruel habit of uncovering what one most wants to hide. Mornings brought nausea. Clara excused herself from breakfast with her father, claiming fatigue, retreating to her room. Staring into the mirror, she saw not only unease in her eyes, but also a spark of resolve. And when her belly began to swell beneath the folds of her dress, there was no doubt left. She was with child. For a Southern belle, pregnancy was supposed to be a blessing, even an honor, if the father were a suitable gentleman. But this time, everything was inverted. The child's father was not the Whitmore heir, nor any other aristocrat. It was Elias, the blacksmith, a freedman by law, but not by society, and the greatest taboo the South of 1872 could conceive. Clara did not panic as one might expect. She did not collapse in tears or whisper frantic prayers for forgiveness. Instead, she laid a hand upon her belly, smiled at her reflection, and whispered, "You are my freedom." Yet hiding such a secret in Harrowfield's halls was near impossible. Servants noticed quickly. They whispered about her pallor, her looser gowns. Rumors traveled faster than horse hooves, and soon the air in the mansion grew heavy with suspicion. Clara took to wearing dark, wide dresses, seating herself in the shadows at dinner. But her father, Horace, sharp as ever, was not easily fooled. One evening, he set down his fork and stared across the table. "You look changed, Clara. Is there something you're keeping from me?" She smiled lightly, her tone calm. Only the weather, father. He said nothing more, but his gaze lingered, piercing, dissecting. Meanwhile, Elias sensed the truth before words confirmed it. When Clara came to him, he asked in a hushed voice, "Clara, is it so?" She nodded, pressing her hand into his rough palm. "I know my body. I am certain." For a moment, Elias was torn between elation and dread. Joy surged. Here, in a land of cruelty, their love had taken root. But fear followed swiftly. This child was a living confession of their forbidden bond. And in the South, such proof could be a death sentence. Clara's smile sharpened like a blade. "Do not fear, Elias. This child is not a burden. It is a declaration. Proof that love defies their false laws." Her words chilled him even as they inspired him. Clara's courage burned bright, but was courage enough to defy an entire world? Soon her defiance grew bolder. No longer did she sneak to the stable under night's cover. She walked openly beneath the moonlight, her steps proud, almost daring the heavens to stop her. Elias begged her to be cautious. Clara only shook her head. "They want me afraid, but I will not fear. Not my father, not this society, but swelling bellies cannot be hidden forever." At dinner one night, Horace studied her long, then said coldly, "Tell me, is there something inside you that does not belong to this family?" The words sliced like a knife. Clara gripped her dining knife until her knuckles whitened, but she did not answer. Horace's lips curled into a bitter smile, his eyes flashing with restrained fury. He said no more, but Clara knew. The storm was nearly upon them. Later in her chamber, she wrote a slip of paper to Elias. "We are running out of time." His rough hands trembled as he read it. He knew if Horace discovered the truth, he would not merely destroy the child. He would destroy Elias in the cruelest fashion. One night, Clara returned to her room to find a white wedding gown laid neatly on her bed, with a note in Horace's hand. "The Whitmore boy is coming. You will do what is proper." Clara stared at it for a long while. Then, instead of weeping or pleading, she opened her window and hurled the gown into the garden. Moonlight washed her face, burning with fire. "This child," she whispered, her hand firm upon her belly, "will not be hidden. It will be the seed that buries their lies." Within her grew not only life, but also a blade aimed straight at the heart of the Harrowfield dynasty. And Horace Harrowfield, when he learned the truth, would not stay silent. Whips, blood, and a reckoning were coming, and none would leave unscathed. No secret survives long in a house as watchful as Harrowfield. And then the fateful day arrived, not through Clara's carelessness, but through the trembling tongue of a servant who spoke what never should have been spoken. On a sweltering afternoon, Horace Harrowfield sat on the veranda, a glass of bourbon in hand, his eyes fixed on the cotton fields. The maid brought his tea, head bowed. For weeks, Horace had harbored suspicions. Clara's slowed steps, her unusually loose gowns, the morning sickness she tried to conceal. All he needed was one final piece. The servant, perhaps from fear or a desire to please, let slip a few words. "The young lady, her belly is growing, and the blacksmith often lingers by the stables." The bourbon glass shattered on the floor. Horace did not shout, did not strike. He simply rose, eyes blazing like coals. He knew. He knew everything. That very night, Elias was confronted at the forge by two overseers. No ropes, no guns, just a nod. Elias understood instantly. They dragged him into the yard where Horace waited. Clara was hauled along, her wrist gripped by Aunt Margaret, the woman whose loyalty to Horace had never wavered. Moonlight bathed the yard, revealing every hateful glare, every ragged breath. Horace stepped forward, his voice a growl. "You have defiled this family. Who do you think you are to touch Harrowfield blood?" Elias did not kneel. He stood tall, shoulders squared, his gaze unflinching. His reply rang firm as iron. "I did not touch Harrowfield blood. I loved a woman, and she loved me." The yard fell silent for a heartbeat. Then came whispers, a cruel laugh from one overseer. Horace's face flushed red, veins straining at his neck. That admission cut deeper than any blade. In blind rage, Horace struck him across the face. Blood dripped from Elias's lip, yet he smiled. Thin, pained, defiant. Clara screamed, "Father, stop! You have no right!" Horace turned, eyes aflame. "I have the right of a father, of a master, and I will show you the price of betrayal." With a flick of his hand, the overseers dragged Elias to the great oak behind the yard, the whipping tree. Its bark still bore dark stains from generations of blood. They stripped him and bound his wrists tight against it. Clara thrashed, fighting Margaret's grip, her voice breaking. "Stop! You'll kill him!" Horace took up a whip, its leather glinting like a coiled serpent in the moonlight. The first crack split the air, carving a red welt across Elias's back. Clara shrieked, tears streaming. The second, the third, each lash thundered like cannon fire, each strike a proclamation that Horace Harrowfield would not let his honor be stained. But Elias did not cry out. Each time the whip tore into him, he lifted his head to meet Clara's eyes, and he smiled. Not in joy, but in unbroken defiance. That smile seared Clara's heart with pain and gave her strength she never knew she had. When Elias's back was bloodied, Horace flung the whip aside, chest heaving. "Lock him in the granary. No water, no bread. Let him learn his place." The overseers dragged Elias, leaving a trail of blood like a crimson path toward tragedy. Clara wrenched free but was seized again. Horace's voice cut through the night, cold as steel. "And what grows inside you? It will be gone by tomorrow. I will not allow this shame to live." Clara froze, her heart pounding like a war drum. But she did not weep. Instead, her nails dug into her palms, her eyes blazing like fire. She was no longer the fragile Southern belle. She was something else now, a flame ready to consume. That night, in her darkened chamber, Clara sat by the window clutching a blood-stained notebook of Elias's, his gift to her. She did not cry. Tears were useless now. Instead, she whispered, "If he wants war, then I will give him war. This is no longer love. This is survival." Outside, the wind hissed through the oak leaves. In the locked granary, Elias hung battered and broken, yet his mind remained unshackled. He remembered his mother's words, "They can bind your hands, but never your mind." And across Harrowfield, two flames smoldered in silence. Clara and Elias, separated but bound by the same truth. The war had begun. A bleeding man in the dark. A pregnant woman facing the threat of her unborn child's death. Pressed to the wall, love had turned into the sharpest weapon. And that night, Clara Harrowfield made her choice. She would not wait to be rescued. She would rescue herself. That night, the Harrowfield estate lay steeped in silence. Only the wind hissed through the shutters and the chorus of insects carried across the fields. But in an upstairs room, Clara Harrowfield did not sleep. She sat rigid at the window, clutching the rusty key she had stolen from the old steward's belt. Each passing minute dragged like an hour. She knew that if she did not act now, her father would carry out his threat come morning, forcing her to destroy the child and leaving Elias to die of thirst in the granary. The very thought boiled her blood. At midnight, Clara slipped into a white cloak, her bare feet moving noiselessly along the darkened corridor. The oil lamps had gone out, leaving only faint embers flickering. Aunt Margaret slept soundly, and the hounds lay curled on the veranda, too weary to bark. The whole house slumbered in oblivion, except Clara, alert and resolute. She crossed the garden, her hem brushing the dew-damp gravel. Her trembling hand clutched the key, equal parts fear and determination. Ahead loomed the granary, a hulking black shadow, heavy with pain. Clara paused, drew a steady breath, then slid the key into the lock. The click echoed harshly in the stillness. The wooden door creaked open, releasing the stench of mildew and dried blood. By the glow of her lantern, Elias appeared. Suspended by his swollen wrists, his back torn and bloody, his breath shallow, but his eyes still burned, unbroken. When he saw Clara, his cracked lips moved, voice rasping, "Clara, you're mad. They'll kill you." Tears welled, but did not fall. She rushed forward, fumbling at the knots, her hands small but relentless. The ropes loosened and Elias collapsed heavily. Clara caught him, cradling him against her. "I don't care," she whispered. "If you die, I die. But if we live together." For a few moments they held each other, only ragged breaths filling the silence. Clara dabbed his wounds with a cloth soaked in rose water she had smuggled. Elias winced but uttered no sound. "We must leave now," she urged, "before dawn." He nodded, struggling to rise. Staggering yet driven by will alone, he leaned against her. Clara wrapped her arm around his waist and guided him out into the night. The air was sharp and cold. A crescent moon hung above like a silver blade, lighting their path. They passed the garden where the untouched wedding dress Horace had chosen still lay tangled in the grass. Clara's gaze flared with fire, then she turned away without regret. Far off, the dogs barked. Someone had noticed the open door. Clara and Elias quickened their pace, her bare feet bleeding from the gravel, his every step a fresh agony. But they did not stop. They crossed the vast cotton fields, the white bowls swaying in the wind like waves on a dark sea. Clara felt as though the spirits of those who had perished in bondage here were guiding them onward. At last they reached the edge of the forest, where dense branches swallowed the moonlight. Clara lowered Elias against the trunk of an oak. Gasping, he clasped her hand, voice faint yet fierce. "Clara, you've lost everything for me." She pressed his hand to her belly. "No, Elias. I've lost nothing. I've found everything." That night they hid in the woods. Clara holding Elias close, warming him, keeping him awake. In her eyes, he was no longer a shackled blacksmith, but the only man worthy of carrying her into whatever future awaited. Behind them, the Harrowfield mansion blazed with light. Horace had discovered their escape. His shouts tore through the night, hounds released, torches lit. The hunt had begun. Clara and Elias had broken free of the granary, but not of Horace's wrath. By dawn, overseers would scour every tree and hut, and within Clara's womb, a fragile life grew, proof undeniable of their forbidden love. This flight was no longer just a struggle for survival. It was a battle to protect the future of a new bloodline. The forest had sheltered Clara and Elias for many days after their desperate escape. They built a rough hut of branches and dry leaves, drinking from the stream and keeping the moonlight as their companion. At night, Clara would cradle her belly, feeling the faint stirrings of the life within her. Elias lay beside her, sometimes placing his calloused hand gently on her womb, eyes shimmering. In those eyes, for the first time, there was something his life had rarely known: hope. Yet Elias understood they could not remain hidden in the woods forever. They needed people, a community willing to protect them. So one night, while Clara slept, he limped through the trees searching, and he found it. A small settlement of freed black men and women, once slaves themselves, living together at the forest's edge, only a few miles from town. The next day, Elias guided Clara there. At first, the villagers eyed them with suspicion. A white Southern lady, visibly pregnant, walking beside a battered black man. It was dangerous, unthinkable. But when Elias told their story, and Clara without fear confirmed it, the suspicion gave way. An old woman with a headscarf whispered, "Lord have mercy, they chose love over fear." The community welcomed them. Women who had long served as midwives took Clara under their care, teaching her how to breathe, to conserve her strength, to prepare for birth. Elias threw himself into labor, fixing roofs, chopping wood, repairing tools at the forge. Though his wounds had not healed, he worked tirelessly. For now, he lived not just for himself. As the months passed, Clara's belly grew. Each evening, Elias told their unborn child stories of his mother, of the letters she carved into trees and earth, teaching him that freedom begins in the mind, not on paper. Clara read poetry, her voice sometimes bright, sometimes breaking. Together they poured into the child a legacy of memory and hope. Then the day arrived. Rain drummed steadily outside, smoke and damp earth filling the hut. Clara cried out in pain, sweat soaking her hair. 3 women rolled up their sleeves, their hands practiced and steady. Elias paced outside, palms damp, heart pounding like a war drum. Each of Clara's cries pierced him deeper than any whip ever had. "She's strong," one midwife told him through the door. "Do not fear." But asking Elias not to fear was like asking the rain to cease. He knelt, whispering prayers he had never uttered before. And then it came. A piercing infant's cry ripped through the storm. Elias staggered, then rushed inside. In the midwife's arms was a tiny boy, skin flushed, fists curled tight. Clara, exhausted and drenched, still smiled with radiant joy. They laid the child on her chest. She clutched him, tears streaming, whispering, "Welcome, my son. You are my freedom." Elias dropped to his knees, hand trembling as it touched his son's head. His voice broke, repeating the only words he could find. "Thank you. Thank you." They named him Malcolm. The messenger. For this boy was not just their child, but living proof, a defiance made flesh. Love could create life despite every boundary. The village rejoiced. Neighbors brought blankets, wooden bowls, even their precious stores of corn for the newborn. Malcolm was not only Clara and Elias's son, he belonged to them all. He was the first child openly born of two worlds in this scarred land, and that gave him power beyond measure. Clara, though frail, embraced her new life. She sat with the women, learning to cook simple meals over open flame, laughing at their gentle teasing. "So the Harrowfield heiress knows how to stoke a fire now?" One elder chuckled. Clara smiled. "I'm no heiress anymore. I am just Clara, Malcolm's mother." The women nodded, their eyes shining. Elias, meanwhile, became a pillar. He repaired the well, built shelters, reforged tools. The villagers began to look at him as a leader. For the first time in his life, Elias felt he had a true home. Yet danger still loomed. Horace Harrowfield remained unyielding. To him, his daughter's disappearance was not loss, it was humiliation. Rumors spread quickly. The Harrowfield girl has run with a blacksmith and borne his child. It struck at the very pride Horace lived upon. He vowed revenge. Clara knew. Holding Malcolm, she whispered to Elias, "They will come, but this time we are not alone. We have a community." Elias gazed at his son, eyes hard as iron. "And I swear no one will lay a hand on him." Malcolm's birth was both dawn and storm. He was a banner, one that inspired, but also one that others would seek to tear down. And as he grew, the question would remain, could love truly change not just a family, but an entire land? Malcolm grew up in a world stitched together by love, yet shadowed by danger. The little settlement where Elias and Clara had found refuge was poor in possessions, but rich in what truly mattered, human kinship. The day Malcolm took his first steps, the village erupted as though it were a festival. When he spoke his first words, the children gathered around him, listening with wide eyes as though poetry itself had leapt from his lips. Even as a child, Malcolm's gaze was unusual. Most children looked upon the world with simple innocence, but his eyes held a depth, bright yet profound, as if he carried the memories of many lives within his small frame. "This child," an elder woman murmured, "was not born just to live, but to remind us." Clara devoted herself to him. She told him stories, recited poems she had once studied, yet her lessons were unlike those of her upbringing. Instead of "obey to honor your family name," she whispered, "Remember, freedom is a gift no one has the right to steal." Elias taught him to hold a small hammer, to carve letters into wood, to recognize words. To Elias, teaching his son to read was not just education, it was defiance. "They once forbade me to learn," he said softly, "but you, my son, will read the world." Malcolm absorbed knowledge at a pace that startled them both. By 4, he was reading short verses. By 5, scratching words onto scraps of wood. Elias laughed, clutching his son to his chest. "You will write what I never could." But brilliance could not hide difference. Each time Elias carried Malcolm to the market, whispers stirred. Some faces twisted with contempt. A black man cradling a child with skin a shade lighter. Others looked on with curiosity, uncertain how to name what they saw. And there were quiet glances of admiration, from those who had endured enough sorrow to recognize a miracle. One morning, as Elias strode through the market with Malcolm in a sling at his chest, a white man glared with open disdain. Malcolm, barely more than a toddler, did not shrink. He stared back, steady, unblinking, and then broke into a wide, innocent smile. The man faltered, turned away in silence. Elias chuckled and kissed his son's brow. My boy does not know fear. Good. The world needs more fearless smiles. Yet Clara knew Malcolm was a thorn in Horace Harrowfield's pride. Whispers already circled. The colonel has a mixed-blood grandson. For a man like Horace, it was a fatal blow. Holding her child close, Clara murmured, You are not disgrace, you are proof. But you must be strong, Malcolm, for your grandfather will never forgive. So Malcolm grew between two worlds. By day, he ran barefoot with the village children, planting corn, laughing when he tumbled in the grass. By night, he listened as his mother read poetry, as his father recounted the lashings at the whipping tree. Even young, he understood. His life was not like other children's. At 7, he asked his father, Why do people look at me as though I'm wrong? Elias hesitated, then answered, Because they are afraid, my son, afraid that you exist. You are what they said could never be, standing right before them. Malcolm thought, then nodded. He did not weep. He did not flinch. He only gripped his father's hand and declared, Then I will make them see. Clara's heart ached with pride and pain. She kissed his forehead and whispered, Yes, my son, but let them see truth, not hate. The settlement came to regard Malcolm as more than a child. He was a symbol, a bridge between two worlds, proof that love could transcend chains. But symbols invite peril. Men of the village often kept night watch outside their hut, pistols at their sides, for Horace's wrath was legend, and no one doubted he would come. Still, Malcolm thrived like flame in the storm. He was the boy who laughed the loudest, who asked the most questions, who dared where others shrank. When a large dog barked furiously, the other children scattered. Malcolm stepped forward, hand outstretched. The beast fell silent, then licked his palm. Onlookers sighed. This boy was born different. Malcolm was no longer merely Clara and Elias's child. He was the community's hope. Yet each year of his growth drew closer the inevitable clash with Horace Harrowfield. And when the boy's voice one day rose before the world, no one would be able to pretend this secret had never lived. If one were to pass by Harrowfield Estate in 1875, they would hardly believe it had once stood as a proud symbol of the Mississippi Delta. The cotton fields, once stretching white as far as the eye could see, now lay abandoned, choked with weeds up to the knee. The marble columns, once gleaming like ivory, were blotched with moss and mold. And inside the vast mansion, only a single figure remained, Colonel Horace Harrowfield. The old man limped through the long corridors, a glass of bourbon perpetually in his hand. Mirrors reflected back a figure that bore no resemblance to the commanding presence he had once been. Hair gone gray and wild, bloodshot eyes, shoulders hunched. Once his barked orders could make hundreds tremble. Now his voice echoed only in empty rooms, with no one left to fear him. His decay had not come overnight, but in slow collapse. After Clara's escape with Elias, Horace saw only a stain too deep to cleanse. He drowned it in bourbon, shouting through sleepless nights, smashing furniture, raging at ghosts. Yet the drink did not erase the past. It only sharpened the memory of Clara, her defiant eyes, her swollen belly. Rumors spread swiftly. The Harrowfield heiress has borne a child by a black man. Among Southern aristocracy, this was ruin worse than financial collapse. Those who once courted Horace's favor turned their backs. Banquets dwindled, handshakes turned cold. The name that once made men rise to their feet became a punchline, whispered in taverns. One evening, Horace sat alone in the parlor, staring at a family portrait. Himself in Confederate gray, his wife posed with elegance, little Clara between them. The painting that once brought pride now mocked him. He hurled his glass, shattering the frame. But the image burned sharper in his mind. He clung desperately to the only thing left. Honor. To anyone who would listen, he raged that his daughter had been bewitched, that Elias had seduced her. He even hired men to track them, but each returned empty-handed. The black community shielded Clara and Elias as if they were sacred relics, thwarting every attempt. As years passed, Horace was left behind. Relatives distanced themselves. Even his own kin wanted nothing to do with the scandal. The mansion echoed with silence, its master resembling a ghost. Servants whispered that at night he muttered Clara's name and wept like a child. The Harrowfield name, once a badge of power, now evoked only disgrace. Overseers abandoned him for other plantations. Horace shuffled out onto the veranda, staring at the fields grown wild, and muttered, "Once at a nod from me, hundreds knelt to pick cotton. Now only the crows remain." Loneliness, people said, was the cruelest punishment for a man who had lived on power. For Horace, each day was a trial where his own memories condemned him. Each lash he had ordered, each cry he ignored, each threat he had shouted. They gnawed at him like dull knives, never killing him outright, but bleeding him slowly. Once he tried to rally. He hosted distant relatives, set tables with silver, raised family banners. But the hall filled with only a handful of guests, their courtesy thin. Over wine, one cousin remarked, "I heard Clara's boy is clever, reading already." Horace slammed his fist. "He is not my grandson. He is a stain." The room fell silent. The guests departed quietly, never to return. In time, the mansion became a hollow shell. Horace rarely left his armchair, clutching his bottle. The last servant abandoned him, leaving stale bread in the kitchen. People whispered that Colonel Harrowfield did not die of hunger or sickness, but of the slow rot of the very name he had worshipped. Meanwhile, across the Delta, Malcolm grew stronger, a living symbol of renewal. The slow death of Horace was the perfect mirror to the boy's rise. On one side, a past that had rotted. On the other, a future blazing bright. Horace clung to honor with his dying breath. But history shows no mercy. While he crumbled in a haunted ruin, Clara and Elias prepared to bring the truth into the open, not only through love, but through justice. And when that justice was spoken aloud, it would strike the final blow against the Harrowfield legacy. The news of Clara, Elias, and the mixed-race boy named Malcolm no longer lingered as tavern gossip. It had become a windstorm that stirred an open debate across the region. To some, they were a disgrace. To others, they were proof that the South needed to change. And all of it led to one place, the courthouse in Vicksburg. It was Elias who first proposed it. He did not simply want to protect his family. He wanted to drag into the light the crimes the Harrowfield dynasty had committed for generations. With the help of young attorneys from the Freedmen's Bureau, the federal agency established after the war to defend the rights of freedmen, Elias filed suit against Horace Harrowfield. The petition was brief, sharp as a blade. 19 years of forced labor, without pay, without rights, in chains. I want back the time that was stolen. The news hit like an explosion. A black man suing a Confederate colonel, a planter? It sounded like fiction. But the papers were filed, and the court was bound to hear it. On the day of the trial, the square outside the courthouse overflowed. On one side stood grim white conservatives muttering curses. On the other, black families and a handful of Northern activists, their eyes bright with expectation. Reporters sharpened pens, ready to capture every word. Clara appeared in a plain black dress, holding the hand of 8-year-old Malcolm. Her step was firm, her eyes ablaze. The crowd fell into stunned silence for a heartbeat as they realized the daughter of Horace Harrowfield was not seated with her father. She was standing beside the blacksmith. It was a slap across the face of family honor. The trial opened with the Freedmen's Bureau lawyer reading out the evidence. Harvest ledgers, slave lists, letters in Horace's own hand during the war. Each document, each number, sliced into the thin veneer of aristocracy Horace still clung to. Horace sat at the defendant's bench, his face mottled red, his hand trembling on his cane. He barked hoarsely, "Lies! They invent this filth to humiliate me," but his protests only deepened the murmur of the crowd. The climax came when Elias stepped into the witness box. His shirt was plain, his back still marked with scars. His voice was low, steady, each sentence etched like iron into the chamber walls. "I seek no blood, no land. I seek truth. We worked, we suffered, we lost our youth for men like him. And we deserve to be called by our names, not by the word property. Heads bowed. A few dabbed their eyes. Even some young white men nodded, unable to deny the clarity of the truth spoken aloud. Clara, too, was called to testify. She stood tall, eyes fixed on the Union veteran presiding as judge, and declared, "I am not here out of hatred for my father. I am here because I will not let my son grow up in a world coated in lies. If the court will not speak truth, then my child will inherit deceit, and as his mother, I will not allow it." From the benches below, Malcolm sat wide-eyed, absorbing every word. For him, this was not only his parents' trial, it was his first lesson in responsibility and truth. After days of arguments, the judgment came. The packed hall fell silent as the elderly judge rose, his voice carrying, "This court grants the plaintiff's petition. Though no award can repay the years stolen, more vital is this. The court declares, whiteness is not inheritance, character is." The words cracked like thunder. Reporters scratched furiously, the phrase spreading across the South and into the North. It was printed on broadsheets, taught in black schools, pinned in humble churches, whispered in kitchens where families once bore chains. Horace Harrowfield collapsed into his chair, pale as ash. He had not merely lost a case, he had lost to history itself. Clara gripped Elias's hand as they left the courthouse. The crowd erupted in cheers and applause. Malcolm stood between them, his head lifted high. In that moment, he was no longer just a boy. He was a future that an entire people placed their hope in. When the court's verdict was pronounced, the name Harrowfield effectively died that very day. Once a symbol of power, it was now spoken only as an example of rot, deceit, and failure. In its place, another name began to rise, Malcolm, the child of love and freedom. Clara and Elias continued their life in the community that had sheltered them, but they did not stop there. They wanted more, not for themselves, but for the next generation. With the modest compensation from the trial, they purchased a small plot of land at the edge of town and built a house of pine and old brick. It was no mansion, but it was filled with laughter, the sounds of children, and the aroma of humble meals. Malcolm grew up in that home, quickly proving himself different. At 10, he stood in a village meeting and read aloud a northern newspaper article about new reforms. At 12, he wrote a letter to the governor of Mississippi, boldly declaring, "We need schools not just for white children, but for all." To the adults, the governor's reply promising consideration was a miracle. To Malcolm, it was only the beginning. Clara watched her son with swelling pride. Once branded a traitor to her bloodline, she now knew her choice had gifted the world a torchbearer. Elias, every time he heard Malcolm speak before a crowd, would stand quietly at the back with a faint smile. He knew the whip scars carved into his back had been transformed into strength in his son's voice. And Horace Harrowfield? The old man withered away in his abandoned mansion. No servants, no friends, no family. One winter morning, they found him dead in his armchair, an empty bourbon bottle on the floor. No funeral was held. No eulogy spoken. Only the wind whistling through moss-covered columns sang his requiem. When Clara heard, she sat in silence for a long while. Then she wrote a single line in her journal. "He chose to live and die in solitude. I chose to live in truth." That is the difference. At 25, Malcolm transformed the Harrowfield estate into a school. He named it the House of Memory. Above the gate, he carved the words, "This place once thrived on silence. Now it endures through truth." Children of color, poor white children, any who wished, came to learn. The walls that once echoed with the lash now rang with voices reciting lessons. On opening day, Clara stood in the courtyard, her hair streaked with gray, her hands trembling, her eyes glowing. She whispered to Elias, "Do you see, my love? Every pain we endured led to this day." Elias squeezed her hand. To him, this was not just a school, it was proof they had won. Not a victory over Horace, but over the darkness of the past. Years later, Clara died at 87. Her gravestone bore only the words, "Clara belonged to no one." Elias, who had passed earlier, lay beside her. They rested under the great oak where once they had whispered vows. By then, Malcolm was a renowned orator. Often he would return to that oak, standing in silence, one hand on the stone, listening to the wind in the branches as if it carried his parents' voices. One afternoon, Malcolm walked again through the old estate, now a thriving school. He carried a small box containing a gold ring engraved with the letter H, the Harrowfield crest his mother had kept for years. At the stone well behind the school, where his parents once exchanged books of poetry, he held the ring over the dark water. "This is for all the names buried and forgotten," he murmured and dropped it. The splash was sharp and final, like a page closing. A young girl from the school happened by and asked, "Teacher Malcolm, what were the people who lived here like?" Malcolm smiled softly, his eyes far away. "They were not legends, they were lessons. And we live today because of those lessons." The child nodded, taking his hand as they walked toward the gate, where laughter of children rang out. The wind swept across the old fields, carrying whispers of countless souls. No longer cries of sorrow, but witnesses of remembrance. The Harrowfield name had perished, but Malcolm, the child of love and freedom, endured. Not because of bloodline nor power, but because he dared to speak memory without shame. And memory, once illuminated, never dies. A forbidden love story had begun with a glance, endured whips, blood, and tears. Yet it ended in children's laughter echoing through a classroom, in a wind that carried memory forward. That was the true victory, not bearing the past, but daring to remember and to forge it into legacy.